Steve Jones, my colleague from Northumbria University, is now going to talk to you about the idea of revenge films. I guess, if you like, it's kind of, it's not nature gone wild, it's kind of when humans go wild. Sounds like some very cheap documentary. Okay, so Steve, anyway, over to you. And when Steve finishes, we'll then have a chance for questions with the three of us. If you can think of anything you want to ask us, we'll give you an opportunity after Steve's finished. So over to you, Steve.
Grand, thank you very much. I'm going to be talking to you about revenge films today. I thought to begin with some context, and that's that as far as we can tell from anthropological studies and cultural studies around the world, revenge is one of the staple themes of narrative storytelling. It seems to occur in most cultures across the world, at most points in history across the world, and it's probably the most second common storyline theme, second only to the boy meets girl romance kind of narrative. So this might beg the question of why I'm only focusing on contemporary American revenge films in particular. And as full disclosure, this paper comes from a project that I've been desperately trying to write for about 3 years now, which began with me wanting to explore the idea of what revenge is. And I wanted to explore that using the way it's represented in films. And I began by trying to track down how many revenge films I would have to watch to make a feasible meal of this. And I began by typing in the keyword revenge into the Internet Movie Database and finding that I had about 4,500 results. And that's without using synonyms such as vengeance or associated terms such as retribution. So it quickly became clear that I wasn't going to be able to do that. So I narrowed down to violent revenge specifically, and then I started to narrow down again by where the largest glut of those films seems to exist. And that's in contemporary American films. So even narrowing it down to films made and set in contemporary America, and by this I'm taking it as being America after the year 2000, I'm still looking at about 900 films, so it's still slightly unfeasible. There's a clear industrial reason why there are so many of these films being made in this period, and that's that many of the films I'm looking at are low to micro-budget features, including Bad Reputation from 2005, Death Angel December from 2010, Raymond Did It from 2011, and Deatherman, which is supposed to be a pun on Weatherman, doesn't really work, from 2012. Simply put, the volume of films made in America in this period, if that escalates, then the amount of revenge films that we're going to see is also going to escalate because it's such a prevalent theme. Nevertheless, by watching these films, I think that there are certain characteristics that these films have that speak to a set of national and cultural values that arise at this time. So by studying these films, I feel like I've learned a lot about American culture, or I see a lot about American culture reflected in these films. I'm actually going to come to that right at the end of this talk. For the most part, in order to set up that, I need to begin with defining what revenge is. This is what my entire book really is going to be about, because the philosophical literature and the psychological literature on revenge is an absolute mess. No one can agree what it is. Everyone conflates different elements and different behaviours with revenge. For the purposes of this talk, I've stripped it down to 3 broad strokes, 3 different ways of thinking about revenge that are just as present in the philosophical literature as they are in the films themselves. So I take them to be a valid way of approaching what revenge is. These 3 visions of revenge, as 3 ideas about what revenge is, don't sit very well together. So let's begin with the first conception of revenge, which is thinking of revenge as a kind of justice, a way of getting even, settling scores in a morally virtuous way. Many revenge films focus around lead protagonists who are our heroes, who explicitly state that what they're out to do is to seek justice, to make right the things that once went wrong, as it were. Here are 3 examples of that: Urban Justice from 2007, Seeking Justice from 2011, and A Certain Justice from 2014. Some of these films problematize that notion that you can attain justice by seeking revenge. Seeking Justice in the Middle, for instance, is one of those films where the protagonist goes out of their way to seek revenge because they think it's the right thing to do, and is later he finds that it is really problematic and it actually messes up his life. Nevertheless, this association between justice and with revenge is well associated and is well established even in the titles of these films. For my other conceptions of revenge, what I'm going to do is say, here's the conception of revenge, and here are some problems. For this one, I'm not, only because the other two conceptions of revenge are the problems for this way of thinking. So for the time being, revenge is a kind of justice. The second way of thinking about revenge that I'm going to highlight is thinking about revenge as a kind of lashing out. And that way of thinking is broadly associated with the term retaliation. And that comes from the association between revenge and retaliation comes from lex talionis, the law of revenge, as it were, the law of retaliation. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and that's a phrase you might associate with revenge taking. That way of thinking about revenge associates a particular behaviour, revenge, with an emotional response. When we think of lashing out, you might think about seeing red, hitting someone in the face, being angry. And that association between anger and revenge is also well established. It precedes Aristotle, but even as far back as Aristotle, we have Aristotle defining anger as a desire for revenge. I'm going to say, who am I to criticise Aristotle, but I'm later going to say that I don't agree with this definition, and I'll explain why. But for the time being, we can see that mapping between anger as a particular emotional response to wrongdoing and revenge, again, even in the titles of films. I didn't name the first film, so if you're offended, I'm sorry, but it exists anyway. Ticked Off Trannies with Knives from 2010, Drive Angry from 2011, Fury, The Tales of Ronan Pierce from 2014, Rage from 2014 too, and I Am Wrath from 2016, all in their various ways use terminology that associates anger with a kind of retaliation or revenge seeking. To give you a sense of how it plays out in the films, even if they're not called retaliation films specifically, I want to play you a very quick clip from the 2013 remake of Carrie. For those of you who haven't seen it, it follows the same plot as the Stephen King book and the Brian De Palma film, insofar as Carrie is a nerdy teenager who is bullied at school. She's from a religiously repetitive background, and the bullying culminates in her being voted prom queen through a rigged voting system, just so the bullies can get her on stage so they can pour pig blood on her head and humiliate her. At that stage, in her humiliation, she lashes out at those people in front of her and unleashes her telekinetic powers and murders virtually everyone. Here's how that plays out in the film. So obviously I've edited that down because the whole sequence lasts about 10 minutes and you didn't need to see it all. All I need to get to is to say that the way that her anger is associated with her taking revenge in this case is via the pumping heartbeat, the rising fury within her eyes turning red so she literally is seeing red, the pathetic fallacy of the fire signifying her anger and so forth surrounding her. But more importantly for me is the fact that when she's angry, she lashes out at everyone in front of her. The two things that I wanted to point out about the clip is only the first, that when she screams at everyone, everyone is consumed, everyone in front of her is consumed by her rage. And the person that she lifts up, sort of Darth Vader style, choking them, is a teacher who's been very nice to her throughout the film, and there's no real reason for Carrie to lash out at that individual specifically. The camera tends to focus on the bullies as they're being trampled to death and so forth, so it feels like it's an intentional type of revenge, but that it's more retaliative in the sense that because she's so blinded by her rage, everyone is swept up in when that rage is unleashed. The reason I want to flag this is because this way of thinking about revenge sees revenge as an impulse, a reflex, something very instinctive, something that we don't think about, and it just kind of happens to us. This way of thinking about revenge retaliation has become associated with revenge via animal psychology and evolutionary psychology. So the idea is that this form of revenge taking is part of our fight and flight mechanism, is buried deep within us instinctively as part of our limbic system, or our lizard brain, as it were. And it's the reason that evolutionary psychologists are quite taken with this way of thinking about revenge is because it helps us to explain why we find revenge in most cultures, that in their documented history at least, across the world. It seems to be a universal aspect of the human experience. The way I get the title for this talk, Wild Justice, is from a way of conceiving revenge in this way that comes from Sir Francis Bacon in a short essay about revenge, in which he makes the off-the-cuff comment that revenge is a kind of wild justice, and that's become a quite famous phrasing, quite a famous way of thinking about revenge. What Bacon's trying to get at is not only this association between our animal instincts, the sort of that lizard brain element, but as a way of then critiquing revenge. Bacon puts it that in a state of nature, before we had law, before we had civilization, before we had society, in order to sort out our problems, if someone harmed us, we would lash out at them. Someone tries to take my stuff, I punch them in the face. He suggests that, sure, when we were more like animals, we might have done that, but that was barbaric, and now we're civilized, and now we ought to do better. Bacon then posits that revenge is a kind of wild justice, and now we should set it aside. It's not a real kind of justice. Now, there are various problems with this way of thinking about revenge. The first is that I find this association between revenge and lashing out as an instinct problematic because it skips over the bit that I'm really most interested in, which is the moral component of revenge. If we take, for instance, this Steven Seagal film, I've seen a lot of Steven Seagal films because virtually all Steven Seagal films are revenge films. I don't recommend watching all of them back to back because they tend to get quite repetitive. Alone, they're all right. In 2009's Driven to Kill, Steven Seagal, as it's posited on the cover, takes revenge because someone kidnaps his daughter. As the tagline has it, they took his daughter, so he's taking them down. Now, the problem with this way of thinking about revenge is it frames that, and this is exactly how it plays out in the film, as a cause-effect statement. They took his daughter, so he's going to kill everyone. And that steps over the important part where he makes a choice to go out and kill them all. Obviously, it wouldn't be much of a Steven Seagal film if it were, they took his daughter, so he called the police, and now he's sat around worrying, he's hoping everything's going to be okay. But nevertheless, he's not really been driven to kill. He's made a choice to go out and kill, and that's an element that I find quite problematic in this model. The second problem here, and here's where I'm going to criticize Aristotle, is that I don't think Aristotle is right in defining anger as a desire for revenge, because anger isn't a desire for anything. Anger is an emotion. It's something that happens to us. According to evolutionary psychologists, emotions like anger or sadness are there as triggers, as immediate responses to things to tell us something is wrong so that we can consider what we're going to do next. And that's the way I would like to separate out anger from the act of revenge. Revenge is something that we decide to do. It's not something that we're impulsively driven to do. Some films associate lashing out and anger with revenge. Some other films problematize that relationship in interesting ways. One of those films is The Crow Wicked Prayer from 2005. It's the fourth Crow film. If you haven't seen it, it follows the same plot as every other Crow film insofar as, in this case, Edward Furlong, who plays the Crow character, and his girlfriend, who you're about to, not Danny Trejo, but the woman with the microphone here, are both murdered, and then Edward Furlong comes back, his soul is brought back by a crow, and he then takes revenge on the people who killed them both. This is the way, I'm about to play, in the clip I'm about to play you, that revenge is presented for us at the very start of the film when his girlfriend, who's about to be murdered, describes the legend of the crow to us. This is so early in the film, the opening credits are still playing.
In times like these, when our community is divided and we hear calls for vengeance, it's important to remember the old stories. We are told that when someone dies, the crow carries their soul to the land of the dead. Then sometimes, just sometimes, the crow can bring that soul back to release it of its burden. To put the wrong wrong things right. What gives the crow his strength? Not hatred, or bitterness, or anger. His strength is love.
Oh, isn't that nice? Nevertheless, and no matter how sloppy it is, 3 people wrote this screenplay, no matter how sloppy that seems, that association between love and revenge in this case is bookends the film. We begin like this, and at the end of the film, when Edward Furlong dies, as happens in all the Crow films, he's reunited again with his partner, and they're kissing in glorious sunlight and so forth. No matter what happens in the middle of the film, no matter how much it seems to be driven by anger, there's a direct separation out of revenge and anger. In this case, everything is driven by love, and we're explicitly told as much. And so what I'm really saying is The Crow 4, who would have believed it, causes problems for Aristotle. The third problem with this way of conceiving with revenge has to do with thinking of it as an animal instinct. There are a number of problems with thinking about it as an animal instinct, and one of them is that when we're speculating about what we were like before civilization, we're only doing that, we're only speculating, because by definition, there is no record of what we were like when we were animals because we didn't have literacy yet, so we have no records. And those people who are trying to define us against what we might have been like and are making assertions about what we were like as animals tend to be doing so in order to stress the differences between those two states and say that we're in a better place now. I'll criticize that again later on anyway. There is one possible solution for us, and that is that we could look to the animal kingdom to see if animals take revenge, especially our closest animal relatives. And at this point, I get to play you my favorite clip of all time.
Man's deepest fear has risen again. Jaws, the revenge. This time, it's personal.
I didn't need to play you that clip because I could have just shown you the poster, but I love the guy's voice. I can't get enough of it. I've seen it hundreds of times. I could just watch it all day. The problem here is that I can see that if Jason Statham were to punch a shark in the face, as I'm promised will happen in The Meg, and if it doesn't happen, I'm walking out, or if a shark is minding its own business and it's wrestled by a zombie, for instance, go and see Zombie Flesh Eaters, then I can see that the shark might lash out. It might try and attack whatever is trying to harm it. Whether a shark can take things personally is a slightly different matter. In order to take something personally, the shark would need a sufficiently developed prefrontal cortex that it can say, there's something wrong happening. That wrongdoing is happening to me because I have a sense of self so that I can allocate the harm to me. It can hold a grudge, and then it can plan to do something about it can plot against the person who's doing the harming. Now, I don't know enough about animal psychology. Well, revelations at the Cult Film Conference. What I'm saying is Jaws the Revenge is not a realistic film, right? Who knew? When I'm saying that, however, I am just speculating because much as we don't have any data about our history as animals, we don't have enough data about animal psychology to make a definitive statement either way. Animal psychology is in its infancy, and I've found as many animal psychologists saying that animals can take revenge as say animals don't take revenge. So here's something for you. I'm just going to leave it hanging in the air. I'm skeptical. I don't think sharks can take revenge, but I'll leave it up to you. You can talk about it in the bar after. Can sharks take revenge? I'll leave that up to you. It leads me, however, to my third way of thinking about revenge. As you might have already guessed, even though the second way of thinking about revenge, of thinking about it as retaliation and lashing out, is very common, it's found throughout the scholarship and it's found across the range of films, in dialogue, in taglines, in plot descriptions and so forth. I don't agree that retaliation is the same thing as revenge. I think we need to separate the two elements out. And that's because when I'm thinking about revenge, I'm thinking about something that is planned and plotted specifically. As the adage has it, revenge is a dish best served cold. And all that statement means is that if, in order to have a successful or enjoyable revenge, you should not do it in the heat of the moment, blinded by fury. You should plot and plan and do it more effectively. To put it another way, in legal terms, we might associate retaliation, lashing out, blind fury, with something more like second-degree homicide. crimes of passion. And there's a distinct difference in law between second-degree homicide and first-degree homicide, which is premeditated. Neither of them are good, but we treat the premeditated homicide more harshly. It attracts longer prison sentences because there are important moral distinctions to be made between lashing out of blind fury and planning something specifically. And to return you to the clip from Carrie for a moment, after she has killed everyone and the whole school was burnt down and so forth, she looks quite visibly shaken, like the whole thing has happened to someone else, or someone's possessed her while she's been attacking everyone. It looks like she's entered into a temporary fugue state, like a state of temporary insanity. That's more like lashing out for me, and premeditated homicide is someone plotting, going, wah, and doing whatever they want to try and harm someone else specifically. So I think this is what distinguishes us from the animals, as it were, that I don't think a shark can take revenge because a shark doesn't have a sufficiently developed prefrontal cortex to understand the consequences of its actions long-term and decide between different courses of actions. Humans do, but that doesn't mean, a la Francis Bacon, that humans are better than animals, that we are now more civilized, and when we were in an animal state, we were horrible creatures that just lashed out and harmed people. Because what do humans use their intelligence for? In many revenge films, they use it to be even more malicious than they would if they were just lashing out at someone. Many revenge gambits are so elaborately planned that they seem to just be unnecessarily cruel. In the case of 12 Rounds 2, made in 2013, if you haven't seen 12 Rounds, don't worry. None of the 12 Rounds films are connected. They all have the same plot, but they've just got a different wrestling star in the title role, and the plot doesn't hinge on you knowing anything about 12 Rounds. The film centres on Randy Orton's character, Nick, who is a paramedic, who is out for the evening with his girlfriend, and they encounter a car crash, and being a good guy and a trained medical professional, he seeks to help the people in the car crash, and he fails to save one of the women involved. A year later, the husband of the deceased woman decides to take revenge on everyone even mildly associated with the car crash, but seems to single out Nick in particular for reasons that aren't explained by the plot. I'm about to show you the trailer of this film. I've just described the plot to you because the trailer does a really bad job of telling you what the story is, because it's just a load of choppy explosions, but nevertheless you'll see why I have to play it for you in a moment.
Hello?
Hello, Nick.
We're gonna play a little game. Why me?
You just happened to find yourself in the right place
At the right time.
You do as you're told, or people die.
I was doing my job.
This game has 12 rounds. Any questions?
Yeah.
When do I get to see your face so I know whose ass I'm gonna kick?
Round one.
Tick, tick, tick.
You didn't really think it was going to be that easy, did you?
I didn't want to do any of this. I didn't have a choice.
What are you doing?
The only thing I can do.
So the revenge seeker in this case has a wall full of CCTV monitors. Some of them he's hacked into the city CCTV systems. In some cases he's planted CCTV cameras in cars and in hotel rooms and so forth. He's abducted people who are going to be buried alive under a mountain of sugar, and Randy Orton has to save them. He's planted bombs in cars so that Randy Orton has to find the right car and then drive it across the city and arrive at a hotel by a certain point in time because someone's going to be in the hotel room at that time. It's like an odd cross between Saw and Die Hard with a Vengeance, and it's one of those films in which, oh my God, the antagonist thought of everything. He's always one step ahead of us. It's one of those films. But to plan something where the entire cityscape has to be aligned in the right kind of way, that's the result of a year of planning, and in which everything has to come together in a precise way, is bad writing. But it's also an indication of how elaborate revenge can be. There are other ways in which revenge film talks about our intelligence in a slightly more potentially productive way. And that's indicated by films such as In the Bedroom from 2001, Reservation Road from 2007, and Trust from 2010, all of which draw from Shakespeare's Hamlet in one way or another, in Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark just procrastinates about whether to take revenge or not for his father's murder. Roughly the same plot plays out in these films, where in each case it centres on a father whose child has been harmed in some way. In the bedroom Reservation Road, their child has died, and in Trust, the child is sexually assaulted. And the father in all of those cases spends the entire film thinking about how they can find the person responsible and what they want to do when they find the individual responsible, and then actually what they end up doing when they're confronted with the choice. All three come to a slightly different conclusion about whether to take revenge or not, and whether revenge equates to justice, or whether a revenge will satisfy their anger, which I won't spoil either way, because these films, unlike some of the other Steven Seagal films that I might have mentioned, are actually worth watching. These films, in unpicking revenge in that way, allow us to think about what revenge might mean. This is kind of the opposite end of using our intelligence maliciously, and this is about us being able to think through the consequences of our actions, almost to the point where it might paralyze us, where we've got so many options and so many different consequences of our actions that we don't know which route to take. But by playing through in this way, it allows the audience to think, oh, what would I do in that situation, and to think through the ramifications of revenge in a way that's more alive to the moral implications. So those are my three different ways of thinking about revenge. But what do these tell us about America, the context out of which they arise? This, what I'm about to say to you, is all broad strokes, because I don't have enough time to fill in the gaps particularly well, so bear with me. America, on one hand, chimes in with that first conception of revenge as a form of justice, because as leaders of the free world, as it were, as they posit themselves to be, America requires that you pledge allegiance to the flag and so forth by pledging to distinct moral values, liberty and justice for all. But that doesn't sit very well with something else that underpins American culture. Even though America's a fairly young nation, and there are some comparisons to be made to Australia here, America's already mythologized its own past. But that past is deeply entrenched in culture, and it manifests as a kind of the associations made between America as a frontier culture or a cowboy culture of the Old West. And none of you should be surprised that I'm mentioning the Wild West in the context of something of a talk about revenge, given that most Westerns are revenge-based narratives. But we see those ways of thinking about revenge echoed in contemporary Westerns, such as Seraphim Falls from 2006, Jonah Hex from 2010, Indian, also known as Scalped from 2013, and Sweet Vengeance, also known as Sweetwater from 2013. All of these films are revenge films, and they're all set, or take the trappings of the Old West, in order to draw our attention, or at least it drew my attention, to something that holds true for revenge films more broadly. What these films, I think, are doing is taking us back to that state of wild justice before law. In American culture at the moment, there's a seeming obsession, or it's been growing over the last 20, 25, 30 years, for thinking about the complexities of law and the relationship between justice and the relationship between our emotions. So in drama series such as The Good Wife or Law and Order, for instance, or in documentary series like the Paradise Lost films or West of Memphis, or The Confession Tapes or Making a Murderer, we constantly see American law as something maybe overly complicated, where people who are maybe guilty of crimes can get off on plea bargains and so forth. There seems to be a separation of justice and procedure or bureaucracy, certainly within American culture more broadly. What I think films like these most explicitly, but revenge films more generally, might be doing is interrogating that relationship between justice and law. One way these films might achieve that is by saying, what would it be like to be in that state of nature before we have established law and society? And in some cases, that might be a clear celebration. It might be much more simple that if someone calls me a prick, then I shoot them in the face, and then it's done. In other films, that we see the complexities of how that might play out. And so someone affronts me, I shoot them in the face, and then their brother comes and tries to attack my family and a vendetta starts. And that's not only true of some of these revenge-based films, Western-based films, but revenge films more generally, such as A Blue Ruin from 2013 or A Death Sentence from 2007, in which the protagonists take revenge and their families, their gangs, come after the protagonist, and things get much, much worse. That way of interrogating revenge suggests that actually it may look simple, but aren't we in a better state under law, because at least then we've got someone to call to help us. In other cases, it is a celebration. In the case of that Steven Seagal film, Driven to Kill, it's a celebration that someone affronts you, you don't do something about it, and you don't have to wait around for the police. Justice is served. That way of thinking, I'm sorry to put Donald Trump up here, he's become that kind of easy target where it's much like if you're having a moral debate with someone and they start talking about Hitler or something, it's got that kind of ring to it. It seems shallow to put him up here. But as the leader of the free world, I think someone like Donald Trump embodies that tension between legal justice, as it were. He's a representative of the state, he's representative of the free world, and that sort of cowboy mentality, that the frontier culture that bubbles up underneath that, not only in his posturing, but in his endorsement of revenge long before he became President of the United States. And I'm not singling out Donald Trump here. That connection has been present for a number of years. The Bush administration, for instance, George Bush Jr., explicitly referred to the war on terror as revenge for 9/11. So it's no surprise that we see those associations also being made in culture, because they're being made by the leaders within that society. There's two other things that I want to connect together, and again, these are broad strokes, so bear with me. The first is that over the last 30 or so years, we've seen a movement in American culture towards what I'm going to refer to here in a crass way as victim culture, because I've got to put something on here that makes sense. In order to distill what I'm trying to say, I want us to think about something like the Oprah Winfrey Show or Dr. Phil or something, where something terrible has happened to an individual and they're brought onto a talk show to talk about the terrible thing that's happened to them, and then the audience applaud them, like Oprah or someone would say, aren't you brave for coming on the show and telling us your story? None of this is meant to belittle the kind of horrible things that individuals have gone through, but if we can imagine that same thing maybe 50, 60 years ago, we certainly wouldn't have been applauding people for having undergone something terrible. We'd applaud people for having done something heroic, and there seems to be more a collapse of that gap between talking about something horrible having happened and bravery. I think some of that stems from America's therapy culture more generally, where people are encouraged to ruminate on their problems, which again is something that we see in revenge narratives, and to talk about their problems as a sort of validating exercise. We also see evidence of that kind of victim culture in relation to the legal system in America, and I think this is unique to America, the advent of victim impact statements as part of the court process. The law is supposed to be objective and impartial, and so often it doesn't give a space for voices for those people who have been harmed. It's supposed to step away so that we don't take revenge on people out of emotion. So we can step back, just look at the evidence, and then make a decision. Increasingly in recent years in American culture, people have begun to try to integrate that kind of emotional response as part of the legal system via victim impact statements, which are after someone has been found guilty of a crime, the people who have suffered that crime are then allowed to submit a statement about how it's impacted upon their life, in the hope that it will encourage the judge to impose harsher sentences. The effectiveness of that technique is neither here nor there. For the moment, I just want to flag that it's part of an increasing valorization of victimhood within American culture. I'm going to set that aside for one moment to talk about something else that connects together with this in a tangential way, and that's the rise of neoliberalism over the last 30 or so years, especially in American culture. By neoliberalism, all I mean is late capitalism, where every individual citizen is treated as if they're a consumer. The marketplace is so diversified that we can each buy precisely what the market is so dedicated to fulfilling all of our tastes that we can buy into whatever type of culture we want to. This encourages us, so it's thought by critics of neoliberalism, into a more individualized society where we are closed off socially from other people. That way of thinking has been amplified, I think, by the rise of social media, in which we might begin to think about the marketplace of ideas more like a literal marketplace where I can buy into some ideas and I can neglect the others that I don't agree with. And that amplifies our sense of individuality by suggesting that my way of seeing the world is just validated by the people I listen to, who also happen to just have the opinions that I had in the first instance, and I just hear them back. So my way of seeing the world looks like the ideas are never challenged by people who have different views. With those two things together, rising over the same period, I'm not surprised we see so many people being drawn to writing and engaging with revenge narratives, because revenge narratives are, especially where the protagonist is the revenge seeker, are based around people who have had terrible things happening to them. They are the victims, as it were, and we celebrate them as heroes. Some of the ways in which we might celebrate them are more subtle than others. In some cases, we might celebrate them by placing them at the forefront of the film, by calling the film after them, as in the case of Julia from 2014, or John Wick is another example. John Wick's dog dies, so he kills everyone. That's the individualism in action. Or in the case of I Spit on Your Grave, where the first personal pronoun is placed at the forefront of the film, or other titles like I Spill Your Guts that play on the same trappings. Individualization is amplified in films such as A Man Apart from 2003, which stars Vin Diesel, and in which an individual can't rely on the legal system to help them, and so they stand alone and take revenge on their own behalf. And The Brave One from 2007, which is a clear valorization of someone who's undergone victimization and then seeks to do something about it. I would say that these films, as they stand, reflect both of those parallel amplifications within contemporary American culture. Another thing then that sits above all this is the rise of a fear culture, especially within America, that's propagated by Fox News and so forth. This is old news, as it were. Or even the idea of fake news, where we can't trust authority voices, so we don't know what to think anymore. Fear has amplified within American culture, even though we're in the safest period of history. There's less violence in the world than ever before. Fewer people are dying of violent crime than ever before. Yet we might be under the impression that the exact opposite is true. It's no wonder that in that state of fear, we've seen a rise of conservatism. And I'm not just talking about Donald Trump and the rise of the alt-right, as it were, here, but I'm also talking more generally about conservatism as a political doctrine. What conservatism means, apart from fascists doing whatever they want to do and so forth, and oppressing the liberals, is a clinging on to traditional values. If you are fearful, you cling on to the things that you value most because you fear they're going to be taken away, and that's what conservatism is really about. The problem for American culture specifically is not that we're returning to tradition as Donald Trump might have it explicitly as a time before civil rights, but actually I think we're in danger of returning to something prior to that, maybe the Wild West era in which there's no justice at all. The final problem then that I want to flag is that in all this, in combination with the rise of individualism more broadly, is that we might be entering into a stage where we begin to see an increase in either moral discussions or moral problems more broadly within contemporary culture. One of the reasons why is because people, when they're fearful, tend to retreat into themselves and tend to separate themselves out from others because they've become fearful of them. Individualism more broadly gives rise to a kind of egoism where not only are we catered for as individuals, like by the marketplace, but we separate ourselves out from others. And there are some political philosophers, such as Michael Sandel, for instance, who suggest that the rise of neoliberalism and late capitalism have tainted our way of viewing the world, morally speaking. It's corroded our moral values, and we then end up separating out from other people. To put it a different way, if I really were a man apart, to use the title of the Vin Diesel film, if I were the only person in existence and there were no other living beings, I would have no need to be moral, because all morality is a way of thinking about what we owe to other living beings. What I think these revenge films are doing then, ultimately, is interrogating those tensions of saying, maybe we need to start thinking about our relationships with one another, whether we need to think about fueling our own anger when people do wrong to us, because that's a moral relationship, or whether we need to think in a much broader way about the relationship between individuals and the state more generally, what we can expect from the state, whether we trust the state, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.